Hi there. My name is Emily Hawthorne, and I am a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst here at RAIN. And I'm here with my colleague, Roger Baker, who is the director of a brand new initiative at RAIN, the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics. So we wanted to take some time to discuss what that is, what that means, and how that will sort of impact this field that we both work in. So, Roger, what is the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics?
Well, I mean, it's a lot of things, but I would say that its primary purpose is to really focus in on the idea of methodology for applied geopolitics. And when I talk about applied geopolitics, there's classical geopolitics and there's all these different academic fields of it. And geopolitics in application has traditionally been used as ways to understand for national strategy, strategic issues. But as we've been arguing for decades now, there is an application of this to international business, to multinational organizations, to NGOs, to anybody who's internationally engaged. And so, what the center is going to do is really work to take, a few decades of experience and development, and try to work to codify certain methodologies that we can then use to help train other people into better understanding how to integrate geopolitical analysis into their other business or organizational processes. That sounds like a lot, but that's a main purpose of what we're looking to do.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of training, a lot of focus on helping organizations understand geopolitics. I mean, what have you found? We've both been working as analysts within Stratfor and now Rain for years. You much longer than I have, and I had the benefit of being trained in part by you. Um, but what would you say is the importance of geopolitics for businesses? And I have an answer to this too, but I'm just really curious about your answer.
I'll throw mine out, then I'll grab yours. The For me, it's one remembering that geopolitics is not a thing; it's a method. It's a way of assessing the world. It's a way of trying to understand um, past patterns, current context, and future direction. And so for businesses, anybody who's involved in business, this is about understanding the map upon which you play, the field of operations, right? It has a predictive element to it. It helps you understand where things are going in other countries, but also between countries. And where it really comes down to play is you can think of it in terms of shifts and adjustments in regulatory environments, shifts and adjustments in global standards and norms. Um, uh, Competition, obviously, between states, where you usually hear about geopolitics, people talk about it in terms of only in terms of competition. Supply chain resilience, right? Small disruptions and ripples that happen. So being able to think forward, to assess the plausible futures, and then to use those to map out what are the implications for business operations, what are my mitigation or opportunity strategies, and then how do I monitor to see which one of those plausible futures we're moving into so I can more rapidly respond instead of waiting until a crisis happens and then being like everybody else going, oh, there was a crisis, we'll call it a black swan, we couldn't predict it, therefore we're not going to be held accountable for missing it. Um, it gives people an opportunity to think forward and plan forward.
Yeah, being proactive, as well as being realistic, and not just constantly sort of playing whack-a-mole with every development as it comes your way. That sort of dovetails with how I've been thinking of it over the last few years. As we do a lot of work within Rain, of course, consulting with companies or talking with them about strategic risks their organizations might face. And one thing I've found about the utility of geopolitics for these organizations is um, companies are focused on operationally and tactically what their business is doing, what's on their plate that day, maybe what's on their plate for the next, few months, 6 months, but overall tracking those big strategic trends, those arcs of history, the things that are unfolding, the way in which the government of Turkey interacts with the government of Russia and how that's going to impact trade relations between them and the relationship between Russia and Europe moving forward. Those things are really critical because, as you said, there's sort of operational and tactical implications that shake out from those strategic trends. But unless you're tracking the geopolitics, which can be very slow moving, sometimes fast moving, but often very slow moving and sort of rooted in history, then it's really hard to understand what's coming in the future or where something might be going. And I think that's one way that my thinking has changed just in general on the world over the last 7 years of being a geopolitical analyst is there's always going to be just like daily buzz of current events and things that are happening every day. There's something to freak out about at every moment, and things can often look like they're fluctuating and changing and just ricocheting, but there is a baseline for things and there are trends that we can follow, and sometimes they shift and change, but we can map those out. And I think that that's what is so gratifying about applying geopolitics to business.
Right, and I build on that. It's something that we've talked about before. It's using these geopolitical frameworks to help tamp down information volatility.
Right.
If you don't know the arc and the flow, the daily information can have you running from apparent crisis to apparent crisis. Often they're not even crises. There's something that is caught within this deeper pattern, that we can identify and that we can help people be able to see and identify. That way you can put your attention not on every possible little new headline, but instead really search for and spend your minimal time that you have, right? The time is terribly valuable. Spend that time focusing on trying to find the anomalies rather than just the noise that's happening all around us. And in today's information environment, it's even harder than it ever was to be able to find, as they talk about the signal and the noise, but to be able to even know what that signal is that you're looking for.
Right, because there's not a it's rare that there's a dearth of information. Sometimes for some questions there is a lack of information, or there isn't a sufficient amount of data for something. But very often, I mean, the questions that we're dealing with when we talk with clients of ours, often there's too much information and our job is helping determine significance. And I think that that's something that every organization in the world is trying to figure out, like, what is the information that is significant for my bottom line, for my business. And that, I think, is really one of the ways in which, um, being trained to think like a geopolitical analyst, really helps you determine that threshold, that significance. What is the line to which something must sort of rise in terms of importance for us to say, that's interesting, that's dynamic, something is changing, sort of in the stream of this trend and how it's unfolding. Um, and that made me think, you know, as you are thinking of the center and as it sort of um, uh, being implemented and taking shape, what do you envision in terms of training? And I ask again because I, as I mentioned, I was able to participate in some training sessions with you, as I was beginning my career as a geopolitical analyst. And one of the sessions that will always stick in my mind is you handed all of us an atlas and you asked us to look at a country that we didn't know anything about, and spend about 20-25 minutes gathering whatever information we could from this atlas. And then we could use that to sort of map out, okay, here are what I think maybe are some of the national security imperatives of this country. Which, it sounds crazy to think that you could do that with just an atlas, but it made me think about how the geography of a space really does determine, and often constrain what a government can do. So I'm curious, are you going to do any atlas training with
Ge-
people?
ge- Geography is at the heart of everything, right?
Right.
When people ask me, how do I define geopolitics, and it's interesting, the field of geopolitics has no definition
Mhm.
for what it is. Everybody has competing definitions. So I look at it as seeking to understand the intersection of organized people and place over time, right? So there's three critical components there. There's a geographical component. Place matters. My favorite Mackinder line I throw out all the time is that there is in nature no such thing as equality of opportunity for the nations,
Mhm.
right? Um, Geography is not deterministic, it's not dictatorial, but geography exerts cost or provides opportunity. and that shapes the way in which populations engage with the geography around them, and why we see the emergence of very different ways of doing business, ways of interacting with one another in different geographical spaces. The geography has played a role in that. So I think geography is a very critical component that, to be blunt, in America, we've become largely geographically illiterate.
Mm,
And that piece needs built back up to really understand what that means, for logistics trains, what that means for population and demographics, what that means for carrying capacity of the land. All of that has an impact on, on how countries are going to develop, how they're going to interact with one another, how they're going to perceive risk and identify opportunity. Then it's the organized people, right? Not just who's the government,
mhm,
but what is society like? How does society relate to the politics, to the economics dynamics, to the security dynamics? And then there's this concept of time.
mhm,
And I look at time in a couple ways. One, is the role history has played in shaping people's perceptions today.
mhm,
History is not a thing. It's not a fact. It's an interpretation. And so history has a large role in the way in which perception moves, and that perception changes over time as history is reinterpreted. So we see, generational differences in views within countries, and understanding how that can change the direction of politics or the direction of social policy becomes really important. History also is an interesting thing in that you can look at things like technology, changes in technology, and identify that at different moments in history, changes in technology will change the relative value of a particular geographic place. All right. Um, so looking at the way in which history plays into this, and then thinking that not that we have to recognize that everything now doesn't just happen now, it happens in the context of the flow of history. And what geopolitics asserts that it can do that, for example, political geography doesn't, or some of these other fields, is that it looks not only at the past and the current context, but it argues that through doing all of these and through this synthetic approach, it can identify the flow of future history. It can lean forward. And again, in business, knowing the future or being able to think forward is the key to effective business.
right. It's almost I mean, yeah, it's almost like a holy grail, and I'm curious about how you would answer to this question, um, that I'm asked often about my work from people who are just curious about it. Um, Strat4 stands for it's shortened strategic forecasting, and I have people ask like, "Well, how can you predict the future? No one can predict the future." And we're not predicting the future, right? Like, and so I'm curious if you could just, expound a little bit on the difference of like, having a crystal ball and predicting the future versus what kind of training you'll be doing in the center and that we'll be working on in the center, to help people, see trends, and to draft forecasts and develop plausible scenarios, and how that's not exactly just predicting the future.
Right. My favorite, and probably about the only political cartoon ever written about Stratfor back in the days of Stratfor was from the Philippines, when we had written and identified that one of their presidents was likely on their way out before the end of their term,
Hmm.
which proved true. But um, and they put a political cartoon in the newspaper, which had a person with a crystal ball, and the person had
Oh yeah,
Stratfor written on them, and then
seen
they
it.
were reading the crystal ball of the president, and the president's stool had crooked legs that said like corruption, nepotism, cronyism, right? And but what we were doing is looking at, one, what were the trend lines in Philippine politics? How what you know what were the critical components that if you brought two or three of them together, you were likely to overthrow the political system and start the next cycle. What were the challenges? We were identifying those, and it was kind of, it wasn't crystal balling. It wasn't tarot cards or anything like that. It was looking at the patterns, looking at the past, looking at the current dynamics, looking at the context, and saying this is the most likely path that we're going. Um, when you talk about scenario building, this becomes really important. And I think one of the other big differences in geopolitical analysis is that geopolitical analysis accepts that there is a lot of qualitative components that need to go in this, not
Right.
just quantitative. Everyone's looking for the algorithms, right? Harry Seldon in the Foundation series built his magic box using algorithms of every human in his psychohistory, right? And you can plug that all in and you can predict the future and know which strands to pull and you can change the future. And everybody today is trying to find, well, if we just have enough data points, we can load them all in and our algorithms, our AIs, whatever you want to call it, will pump out the answer and that will be it. And it's not like that. There are so many things that do not have quantifiable factors to them,
Right.
but you have to take them into consideration. And so putting a greater rigor, and over the last quarter century, we've worked from the origins to now on constantly adding layers of rigor and seeing what improves forecasting capabilities, what doesn't improve them, what becomes counterproductive, and trying to weed out the purely subjective and create an objective path that again isn't necessarily quantifiable, but is able to see what I would, like I said, when I talk about the future flow of history, it's not events, it's not moments in time. It's what are these big forces? And then you can use an intelligence methodology and you can use um, creative thinking to say, what are the implications if that path starts going that way on these tactical operations or these more specific items. And that puts you then into the path of targeted intelligence collection and analysis work to figure out the meanings for those. But the big path, I think, is something that people often overlook.
Mhm.
And it's really critical to understand the larger road to then understand the little traffic patterns within it.
Right. Um, yeah, and that scenario building is something I think more and more organizations are doing. And even if they're doing it internally, one thing that I know you and I have both worked on with different clients is sort of being a part of red teaming that analysis and, bringing in, uh, somebody who's not within an organization who can then look at it objectively. I mean, that's the premise behind consulting, but this is something that we do with our scenario building is sort of here's what we think is plausible, does it match up with what you think is plausible? And then sometimes when there are those divergences, that's where the most interesting and gratifying exchange can take place. So, and one question on the training: are you going to have people reading Clausewitz, or?
We will pull from lots of different things for readings. I don't know that people are going to have to dig through all of Clausewitz or pull out their Mahan or anything like that. But I think that there are little bits and pieces out of from historians, from intelligence analysts, from early geographers that are really valuable and important. And then a little science fiction, because one of the final pieces is that it's one thing to identify future patterns. It's another thing to communicate them. And
Mm,
one of the things that science fiction or fiction often gives us is insights into the way of thinking of narrative of the future
mhm.
that becomes graspable and understandable, but also thinking about ways that small adjustments can have big changes long down the road so that we're not caught in a very narrow gradualist viewpoint. I think that there are surges in these historical patterns in the past, and certainly there will be going forward in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting that science fiction can help prevent against that sort of analytic fallacy of just thinking deterministic, like this is the path we're on, inertia is going to keep us going, and sort of shaking yourself up from that is really really valuable. Well, we're coming up on time. Is there anything else that you'd want to share about the center as it's just getting started here before we close today?
I mean, I think one other thing to keep in mind is the field of geopolitical analysis and the recognition of the need for geopolitics into business, into broader international relations is rising tremendously. But there's not a lot of effort yet for putting some rigor and constraints on it. So it's really wild, wild west. And I think that one of the things we're looking to do is to work with others to start putting a framework around this. There's no, you don't have to have necessarily a licensing body or things like that, but what are the standards so
Mhm.
that consumers and people who are applying this can start to create that center of trust. And we've seen that. You see that in intelligence professionals, you see it in corporate security professionals, you see it in CFOs, you see it in all these fields that interact with the business community, have their little segments and their communities and their bodies that help to put some sense of trust on there. I think that we're high time for trying to build that out in geopolitics, and we're hoping that the center can serve as a place to draw other people from this field together to put that frame around it and build that sense of trust and confidence, which will then strengthen the use of this as part of not only strategic planning for businesses and organizations, but better understand how to integrate it into, as you noted, some of the tactical and operational elements of their organizations.
Awesome. Well, I am very excited to see where the center goes. I know you are too. And thank you for taking the time to discuss a little bit about geopolitics in the center. For everyone else, you can learn more about the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RAIN and how it can work for your enterprise at rainnetwork.com. And thank you for joining us.